Hello and welcome to Northampton Film Festival and our Q&A with the producers of Surge. We've had a very busy day. This is our day 4 of the festival, the Screen Northampton Academy Day. So basically a day of free talks, workshops, Q&As, to hopefully kind of give people a little look behind the scenes of the film industry, which is obviously the ethos of Northampton Film Festival. This year, as we've said, our theme is kind of a big deal, but we're only kind of a big deal with the people that agreed to come and talk to us and to take part in these Q&As. And so really, really excited to have with us today, as I say, the producers of Surge, so Julia Godzinskaya and Sophie Vickers. Welcome to our lovely, lovely live stream.
Thank you.
Well, so let's start off with just a bit. Tell us a little bit about the film Surge. Some people have already seen it, as it's been live since 6 o'clock on Friday with us, 6 o'clock on Thursday with us, and it's live till Sunday at 6 o'clock as well. But give us a little bit of an insight for those that may or may not have seen it.
So Surge is the debut feature of filmmaker Adil Karia, who had previously worked on shows like Top Boy, and it's set in London. And it takes place over about 48 hours. And the lead, played by Ben Whishaw, who's in our film is called Joseph, goes on a kind of reckless journey of self-liberation across London.
And so how did the film come to you? How do you guys get involved?
Well, Anil actually came to us with a treatment, and he had previously collaborated with Ben Whishaw on a short film called Beat. And that relationship, they had such an amazing time working on that film together. And then, obviously Ben went off to do Paddington and Bonds and so on, and Anil went into the TV world. But I think there was always a desire to continue working together. And so Anil came to us with this kind of kernel of an idea and a treatment around, bank and research into real world bank robbers. And it wasn't that the reality of bank robberies in the real world isn't that this kind of bombastic affair in the way that you would see in the Hollywood films, but something much more grounded. And the profiles of the majority of these bank robbers was kind of a common thread, in terms of people who are, men mostly in their kind of, 30s, who felt emasculated in parts of their lives. And this was like a way of taking charge and being seen rather than the acquisition of money, particularly in the contemporary context where there's not a lot of cash being held behind the till. So it's not like, bags and bags and bags of it. And so I think he was quite fascinated in the psychology of this and what it means for someone to be pushed to a breaking point and start rebelling against the norms of what we the parameters that we set forth in terms of how we interact with other humans, our physical limitations, and what is socially acceptable, and start exploring this kind of middle ground between what we come to define as well health and ill health. And so that was kind of it was very highly kind of conceptual. And so we then went on a writer search with Neil, and started kind of, brought on board financing partners to help us on the development journey, and just started working on the story from scratch, basically.
And I mean, we were just talking before about the kind of timing of this, because it feels very pertinent. But when was this shot? And I mean, now that it's coming out, obviously, in this weird time that we're in, how well does that kind of work for the project?
Well, it remains to be seen how well it will work, because the film goes on general release at the end of May. So I think whether people respond differently to, say, how the audiences responded when the film premiered at Sundance, which was just before the pandemic, we'll find out. But the film was shot in 2019, so very much the pre-pandemic world. And then it premiered just before, so Sundance Film Festival in 2020, which we since learned was a sort of petri dish. Everyone came back with COVID. And so I think some of the themes of the film, social isolation, loneliness, the pernicious effects of an urban environment, I think people will feel differently about now. I think we all feel differently about what it means to live in a city, what it means to be alone. And, the film is a very busy, very noisy London that, it's quite hard to remember. And so I think it will be interesting to see whether people respond to the film feeling that that's a London that they want to go back to or experience again, or feeling sort of how Joseph feels, which is that environment is actually quite oppressive.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, it came across when I was watching it that, how important is it that it was set in London rather than any other kind of urban environment? Was that important?
I think the director would say it's very important, because he didn't grow up in London, but has lived in London for his adult life, and he has a very particular relationship with London that he has explored in some of his other work, and in Top Boy as well. And I think that he obviously can't speak to what it's like to live in another city in England, or indeed in the world. But, I think London is a hard city to live in, particularly for those who maybe aren't from London. I think it's big, it's sprawling, it's polluted, it's hard to get around. I love living in London. I've grown up in London, but I think not everybody feels that way.
No, and I was kind of interested. I believe it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week, and I was kind of interested to find out a bit more about the kind of the appeal about or not about kind of confronting some of these issues about mental health. And for both of you as producers, was that something that was really drew you into this project?
I mean, the director never pitched the film or positioned the film as a film about mental health in the sense of, Joseph has X problem or diagnosis, and that's what we're exploring. I think he was particularly interested in mental health that lies outside the boundaries of diagnosis. So, as Julia mentioned earlier, the space between wellness and illness that I think a lot of us exist in without actually being clinically depressed or having schizophrenia or OCD or some of the other diagnoses that you might think, oh, that's what Joseph has got. Perhaps he does. That's not a question that we answer in the film or indeed explore explicitly.
But I think it's a question of when someone stops abiding by the rule book and starts rebelling against those kind of boxes that one is put in and exploring the outer bounds of what it means to rebel against the rules, rebel against the status quo, or express themselves physically in a way that is perhaps looks unacceptable. Why, it's a kind of commentary on we label, and he explored a little bit of that in Beat, the short film that he did with Ben. But really, it's like, what does this say about our society at large that it's such a kind of, it's a kind of black and white label, right? It's like we should be celebrating. And then for Neil, I think the intention was very much this is a person who's going on a journey of self-liberation, and who's doing it in a way that none of us would ever dare to do, because we just can't step outside of those bounds without consequences. And obviously there are consequences to him as well in this film. So, yeah.
I mean, Ben Wishaw's performance is, I think one reviewer called it mesmeric, and yeah, it absolutely is. He's fabulous. But I thought actually the casting of everyone was brilliant. I mean, what was your process with that, and also bringing on all the other crew and the just general talent to the project?
Well, I think it was extremely important to Anil as a British Asian that the cast was diverse and represented London as it actually is. He had just come off Top Boy, which is obviously also has a very diverse cast. So we worked with casting director Lara Mannering, and Anil also was very closely involved in the casting process and cast some actors that he had worked with before, including on Top Boy. So Jasmine Jobson is I don't want to give too much away, but one of the bigger female roles, and she worked with Anil in Top Boy as well. And then in terms of the rest of the crew, it was a mixture of Anil's collaborators that he had, long-time collaborators. So Stuart Bentley, who also shot the short film Beat, he had worked with on, a number of occasions before. And then, the crew that we hadn't worked with before was, just sharing some insights on the film and getting them to pitch, basically.
I mean, filming in London, you're a lot of it is out on the streets. It's busy. It's frantic is probably quite a good word for it. I mean, how was the shoot? I'd imagine it was quite manic in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Neil, it was making it as real as possible. That was like, if we can get, and we, the airport shooting at Stansted Airport particularly has never been done before in the security lanes. And so that was kind of, it was hard to get the permission, but it took us 3 months before we even started prep to get that permission to shoot inside those lanes and figure out how we would actually get equipment in and out and how we would organize the shoot around that. And that's obviously a heaving live airport, and the airport's obviously not shutting anything down and everything is ongoing. And it was like kind of in the middle of the summer where people are going on holidays. So we got, 3 dedicated security lanes, and everywhere else, like everything that you see in the background are real people going on holiday, basically, in Stansted. And so, I think that was like one extreme, but also, all the scenes in the streets featured, real people whose permission we got to film. So there were kind of no plot, we didn't like plug in extras and got like extras buses in to populate those streets. So it was, the aim was always to get the authentic London that we all know. And then, of course, I think when it comes to to the robberies and some of the interiors, I think the limitations for us there were we had to create a controlled environment, because there surprisingly wasn't a bank around that was happy to let us rob it. So yeah, it was I would say 90% real locations, real people, real London streets, and it was a real challenge for that.
Well, yeah. I mean, we go on about Northampton as a filming location because it's, it is the polar opposite of London. It's very easy to control streets. It's very easy. You can get across the whole town in about 10 minutes. Whereas I started off my life as a location manager in London, and that scares me. I mean, what was the kind of reaction generally to working in that way from the public? Were people generally, we always talk about fatigue in London. Everyone's seen the film crew around every corner, and actually can be not particularly helpful. But actually, it sounds like you were able to get quite a lot of love.
Well, I think the realities of filming on the streets in London, you just have to be leaner than. You're not a Hollywood production. You're not shutting down streets and corners and all of that. So I think it was quite a contained unit. Obviously, we did draw attention, and some people did recognize Ben and would stop and kind of look what's going on. But on the whole, I don't know. It was just so busy. It was just such a crazy busy summer that we kind of went into the masses and were relatively unscathed. Like there wasn't any. There was just kind of no incidents, I think, or we didn't kind of stick out like a sore thumb. I think we're really very much bedded in. I think if you're shooting outside, you're not using, you're using natural light as much as possible, having huge lighting setups. So all of that was really very much reserved for the interiors. And so, yeah, I think we managed to kind of get unnoticed. And Ben was slightly unrecognizable. He shaved his head. So I think people just there wasn't that like, oh my God, it's Ben Whishaw, draw, because he just looked nothing like himself, really. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, there was a few moments where I won't spoil anything, but he's walking through the streets and people are looking at him, but there's potentially other reasons they're looking at him.
Yes.
And it worked very well. Well, I'm always interested, as I always say to people, I love how did you get into film story? Like, I'd love to just kind of hear what's your backgrounds? How did you come to this?
Well, I was an entertainment lawyer before sort of segueing into the film industry, which is sort of a more common route in Hollywood. The thing is about becoming a producer is everyone comes from a completely different background. Some people come from sort of physical production, working their way up that sort of, production manager, line producer route. Some people go to film school. There's really no set way into it. And so for me, I was a lawyer and then, hustled anyone who I had ever met or friends of friends who worked in the film industry until, someone gave me an opportunity. Legal training is incredibly useful in producing because there's a lot of contracts, there's a lot of negotiation. So it's definitely a kind of relevant skill, but it's one of many that you you sort of need to have or develop as a producer.
Yeah, and Julia, what about you?
I mean, my route was slightly outside of this country. I studied in Los Angeles, studied business and film, and then while I was at university, just like everyone else, doing internships at studios and production companies. And then when I came out the other end, unlike in the UK, there is the kind of traditional like route in, which is the mailroom. So I joined an agency, went into the mailroom, sorted mail, got put on a desk, worked as an assistant for an agent. And I think, in Hollywood, this is kind of this is like where you get the bird's eye view of the industry, and they call it a Hollywood boot camp. And then those who are tough enough stay, and those who are not drop like flies. And then I worked with an agency for 2 years, and then I moved over here, worked for a producer who kind of gave me an in into the the UK film industry, which I had nothing to do with previously, and then hustled to, make my first film, My Brother the Devil, and that was really just went into, from assistant to producing in that way. Yeah.
And how was Rook's Nest formed? How did you two come together?
So Rook's Nest was formed really out of My Brother the Devil in some ways. So, that was the very first film that I produced under Rook's Nest. And that was kind of the thing that kind of gave life. And once, My Brother the Devil was out in the world and premiered at Sundance and did the festival rounds, received kind of all the awards, which is lucky as well. I mean, I think the first time you just kind of don't know what you're doing. And I was lucky enough to have caught and collaborated on that movie with Gail Griffiths, who was a much more senior producer than myself, and so she taught me a lot about how to produce a movie. And but really off the back of that, once we came out the other side of that film, I was like, right, okay, I guess Rook's Nest is a real production company and is going to continue rather than do like the one thing and then die a slow death. And then that's kind of how we kind of got started, and then Sophie joined soon after that.
And like, what's the dynamic? I mean, I'm assuming, Sophie, obviously legal might be where you kind of sit, but how do you work together? I think it's quite a difficult thing sometimes to come together and do this as a group with different people with different skills and interests and whatever else.
Yeah, we're kind of like a sort of two-headed beast. I don't know, we've been working together for such a long time now, coming up to 10 years, that, we can finish each other's sentences. So I think it would be hard for us both to define who does what, but it's fairly seamless. Loosely, Julia runs the business and I'm head of development, but we both produce. We're both involved in the creative side. We both bring new projects in. We both raise the finance. So there's not really a sort of obvious division of labor. It's just very obvious to us.
I think also it's kind of complementary networks, because my network's primarily was primarily in the US when I set up Rook's Nest. And so My Brother Devil came to us via the Sundance Film Institute rather than via some UK roots. And so I think the films that we've been involved in is a reflection of that kind of bi-coastal approach, really, and something that we continue to do and pride ourselves in. And I think the Rook's Nest really was conceived and modeled after some of the independent production companies that I had, some of which I worked for while I was in LA, that operate outside of the kind of institutions and outside of the kind of boundaries of regional boundaries within the UK. So that's very much in our DNA now, and I think a reflection of just Sophie's and my own kind of networks and brains and relationships that we've cultivated that are across both sides of the pond.
Well, actually, we've got a kind of a very appropriate question that's just come in, actually, from Daryl, who's actually who's been tuning in all afternoon, who's actually the director of our first feature film, Beth. What's your path to selecting the films and stories you make from discovery to green light?
Well, I think, go ahead.
I think we're very filmmaker driven, and that goes both creatively and also personality is actually a big part of that selection process. Making a film is a very, very long road, and you don't want to do that with someone that you couldn't have a drink in the pub with. And so I think for us, it's sort of, who is the filmmaker and what is their body of work? How strong is the idea, and does it have the potential to break out internationally, which is a big thing for us. We don't want to just make British films for British audiences, and then be sort of, do I actually like this person?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Julia, have you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think we're thinking, as I kind of just the way that I described the company, I think very much is how we pick movies. I think we have to see them break out in the US. We have to see a theatrical potential there. We have to see them in one of those festivals. I think we're not interested in just making local films for local audiences. And in some ways, I think it's a shame, but I think it's just the reality of the UK distribution landscape and it being still very much reactive towards what the US puts out. Who are the big kind of films that pop over there and then they get picked up here? There isn't this. The UK isn't like France or Italy that has a real kind of homegrown nationalistic kind of film industry where, someone like Paolo Sorrentino can make all his money back in his own local box office in Italy because of the kind of, the kind of fan base, but also because of the local language. So the UK inadvertently participates in the global space, whether they want to or not, and is pinned. UK independent films are set alongside American independent films, and so those stories and visions and production values need to be at the same level. Otherwise, it's pointless, And yes, of course, there's like films that break out that are totally unexpected that will always be. But I think in terms of what we're selecting and what interests us is filmmakers who have that ambition, who can speak that kind of more global English independent kind of space language, if that makes sense. And I think what's been exciting to see out of the UK is that more and more filmmakers are starting to dare themselves, to step outside of what previously felt quite strict boundaries of what independent British film would look like and would be supported. And so, that's kind of one of our key barometers. But as Sophie says, I think, we don't have big shareholders to respond to. I think it comes down to our personal taste and relationships and us really believing that we can feel as passionate about the idea as the filmmakers, because if we don't, it's just never going to get made. It's too hard, too long of a road. And, you want producers who are just like as willing to do anything for it as anyone else. So it's somewhat a kind of self-selective process, I feel.
Well, yeah, we were having a discussion on one of these Q&As earlier in the week about, about the state of the British film industry, but also, that so many people are having to look. It's not Britain that is funding these films. They're looking for finance elsewhere because, we don't seem to have enough getting behind our own projects. I mean, how without, I assume there's lots of things you can't tell us, but how would you go about kind of getting together the funding for your films in quite general terms, or whatever you want to talk about?
Well, I think when we started off, we were very much looking stateside. That was our focus. I think the remits within some of the funders here in the UK have changed massively over the last 5 years, I would say. There's much more risk taking. There's a little bit less of like, these 5 household names are the only ones that will be supporting, whether it's screenwriters or writers. It was just kind of the same old. And I think finally the remits are taking way more risks on filmmakers, allocating appropriate budgets to that. And so I think now, our slate is very much half projects that will be completely independently financed out of the US with the US financiers, and then projects that we are working with BBC, BFI, and Film 4 that will have a component of foreign or local equity and independent investors on board. And the landscape just keeps constantly shifting, and it's hard. The resources in the UK are limited for the amount of talent that keeps getting cultivated here. And so, I think it's the US and the UK we just have to continue working hand in hand. And indeed, someone like the BBC and BBC Film and Rose and Eva are very proactive about building those relationships, and a lot more US financiers are interested in investing in British independent films alongside some of those institutions.
And talking about not taking risks so much, but about the scene changing, I don't know if you have any thoughts about being, women film producers, and kind of how maybe the landscape has changed since you began, or whether actually you don't find that there's any kind of barriers to being women in film?
I think the one significant barrier is childcare, and that's the same for female directors and female crew more generally. I mean, I think, producing is actually quite a female-friendly job, and there's a lot of, I think the statistics are about 50-50. Yeah. So, and of course you can be totally more or less totally office-based as a producer, because some producers aren't on-set physical producers. Julia and I both have children. You make it work. But I think there's some really interesting campaigns to make childcare, a sort of budget line item, and to enable women who are also mothers, perhaps with younger children, to be able to go on set more easily.
Yeah, definitely. But one more question before I bring it back to Serge about the producing route in generally. So obviously, I say we work with a lot of young people who are starting out. Have you got kind of a one bit of advice that maybe when you were first starting, or whatever else that you think would be pertinent for someone looking to get into the role of producer?
I think you've got to really, really, really want it. It's not an easy job. It's a really frustrating job at times. If you imagine a producer's daily life as being, 99 no's for every single yes, that can be quite demoralizing. Some people say you have to have a thick skin. So I think you've got to be really sure that this is what you want to do. I remember when I started out, my boss at the time is quite a seasoned producer, in his 50s, had been around the block. And he said, I don't know why you want to do this. And I don't know why you want to leave your good legal career. And, if I had my time again, I wouldn't be a producer, because although the highs are very high, the lows are extremely low, and there's too many of them. And when I did leave my job, which was quite a cushy job as a lawyer, people thought I was crazy. So, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I think that's
back, so I am still glad that I made that change. Yeah.
Yeah. And Julia, what about you?
I mean, I completely agree with that. I think for me, I kind of never wanted to do anything else, even when I didn't fully know what it all entails. But I think it's hard. I think it's harder. I was in LA. It's a very different world. There's so many more opportunities, so many more roads in of how to get into the business. There just aren't that many here in the UK. And it's hard, I think it's hard being in an independent kind of outfit. And I think one piece of advice is to get in any way you can, because as Sophie says, like, any experience is great experience, right? And whether you're coming at it from a legal background or a sales agency background or distribution, all of those things are completely invaluable. The only route in isn't like, I need to go work for a producer, because I'm like, actually, no. Because like, when the value add comes at all of those different stages, right? And I think, I actually did a business degree, and I'm so glad I did, because I now run a business, because that's also part of it. You might find yourself in a position where you are, chances are you are setting up all of these different SPVs for every single project. And so you have to have a baseline understanding of how to operate them, how to file returns, how to do all the unbelievably boring bits that are outside of like standing on set and like hanging with film crews and going to festivals, right? And those kind of harder skills are, I think, invaluable and would make really good producers, because it gives you a cornerstone of an expertise. And whether that's something market facing, where you really understand the market and what it wants, and it informs the kind of projects that you're drawn to, or if you've worked for a financier and see how films get put together and who finances them and what levels they finance. It's a lot of producers, if you're coming just from a development point of view, you're just not privy to that. And if you're not privy to that, you're kind of slightly operating in the blind vacuum of like the dream world of like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do this with this filmmaker, without the realities of like what this thing should cost, who would actually buy it, how do you get it off the ground? Do you know what I mean? Like it's so I think it's being open to whatever opportunity presents itself to you at the starting point, rather than being, I just want to be a producer and I have like a really set idea of how to get there, because there's many different ways to get there, and a lot of those routes are always going to be value add in the end. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah. So I mean, it's one of those things where I think some of the best advice is like kind of Sophie was saying, is to tell people how hard it is and to try and put them off. And if they still want to do it, that's probably they'll probably be all right if they can take all that.
Yeah, I mean, the agencies in the States do that for you.
Yeah,
it's like a much hostile environment all the time. And if you still want to do it after you get phones thrown at you, then you clearly should continue because you're insane.
Yeah. So obviously people can see Surge with us if they're watching this live until 6:00 on Sunday. But after that has happened, where can they see the film? How is it coming out, especially in this very weird time that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, well, Vertigo is releasing it in the UK on the 28th of May, and it's going to be day and date, which means it's going to be in select theatres across the UK. And on various kind of platforms, VOD platforms.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so, you know, the cinemas won't all have been announced yet, but, you know, we can say now that it's an art house release, so, you know, it'll be the likes of Home in Manchester and, you know, the Cousins in London. So look out for it in your local art house cinema if you haven't seen it yet.
Great. And I mean, what do you kind of hope that people who see it kind of come out of the cinema thinking, feeling, going to that pub and having that pint and having a discussion about it? What's your hope for people to take home from it?
I think that you know, I think that some people find it extremely intense, and some people will find it full. Some people will find it dark. Some people will find it strange. But I think, you know, it's definitely a film that people will discuss, and I really hope that the experience of living through a pandemic sort of adds more color to the experience of watching it. And I hope that some people feel that after a year of lockdown that maybe they would like to break the rules as well.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that's a great line to leave it on, to be honest. And thank you very much for joining us. Like I say, I very much enjoyed the film, and I hope that it goes on to do good things, because I think there's some really great performances in it. So thank you very much for joining us, and good luck with it.
Thank you. Pleasure. Bye.
So that is the end of our live streams for this afternoon. But we come back this evening, if you're watching live, on the 15th of May, to do a Q&A with with some of the key crew of Moon. So I hope you will join us for that. Thank you very much, everybody.